All right, so back here with the Autonomous Humanity podcast, a little bit different of a format than typical. Was supposed to have a podcast with my co-host Jim. Unfortunately, he got COVID, and we have a upcoming trip to do another few podcasts that he wanted to make sure he was recovered for. So let me just cover what that will look like. We have a podcast with Ethan Krause, the inventor of the ionic wind aircraft, very much like a Wright brothers of sorts, if you will, for ionic wind aircraft. We're probably not going to see the most commercial success with it. Of course, I would love to be wrong for his sake and the sake of everyone that could benefit from the technology. But again, like the Wright brothers, didn't really have the greatest commercial success with manned aviation either. And then we're going to have a podcast with a great family friend the following day. But actually, between those two, we also have a podcast upcoming with Roger Mortimer, the owner of Ohio Drone Repair. I think that'll be a great episode for any of those that are interested in the drone industry, specifically a lot of the opportunity that comes with it. But this episode is all about freedom and bravery. And this has been something that's come to mind over the last really month or two in particular. I think even going back to late or mid-July at this point, was driving to work here at the Ivy Robotics office. And I drive with my producer, and just it came to me how far away we've drifted from the ideals that are written or even sung in our Star Spangled Banner, our national anthem, land of the free, home of the brave. And I just don't meet many, really, if any, Americans that really, I think, positively portray those ideals. And so I wanted to talk with Jim about these, especially I went to a event now a few weeks back up in South Carolina, where they had a guy that was also big into the history of the Star Spangled Banner, the poem that it originally came from, did a great job singing it. But they also had what was called the South Carolina Republican Creed that I think really stood out. So I do want to get to that. But before doing so, just diving into a little bit of the Star Spangled Banner. Obviously, just about every American is familiar, or at least should be familiar, with the line, land of the free, home of the brave. But what maybe a lot of people don't know about is the whole Star Spangled Banner is actually part of a poem that came from the War of 1812 during the Battle of Baltimore. And the poem is actually called The Defense of Fort McHenry, or McHenry, if you will. And so this fort was being bombarded by the British for 25 plus hours straight, starting September 13th of 1814. And again, went day and night throughout September 14th. And that's when the poem was originally written by Francis Scott Key. And again, around this time, more than 200 years ago, 211 years ago now, and then published about a week from today, September 17th, 1814. So a week from today, roughly speaking, 111 years ago, 211 years ago. I can do math. But while I'm not calling for every American to enlist in the armed forces, right? I do think it is our civic duty, as much as that's been, commonly talked about by some of the greatest, most influential American figures. I think it's oftentimes lost on how those were just normal people like you and I. And it seems so out of the realm of possibility to get involved in federal politics, especially, but not everyone, of course, has to get involved at the federal level. There's great ways to provide public service, where I don't think we should be forced to, join the armed services. I don't think there should be a draft, a big believer, I see my body, my choice beyond the way that it's typically referred to, right? And so while I think it is great if everyone does public service to some degree, obviously I don't think we should be at a point where we're forcing people to. We should incentivize and encourage people to, and whether that's putting on a military uniform, buttoning up and, offering your services as a public school teacher. I think that's where we could use a lot of help in this country as well. And then, of course, local politics is always an option that I think many people see it as a black box, but go get involved in your county commissioners meetings, have conversations with them, have conversations with your mayor. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised to see just how accessible it is to get involved and even run for office if those people already holding those seats aren't representing those same ideals that you're interested in, or, think your fellow Americans will be interested in. But going into the South Carolina Republican Creed, as I mentioned, I had never heard about this previously. And this was actually, again, at Nancy Mace's gubernatorial event. She's running for South Carolina governor, went up there to put a name to a face. And I wasn't sure exactly what to expect, but it seemed like great timing where everyone went around, did the Pledge of Allegiance, recited the Star Spangled Banner or national anthem. But then there are these cards handed around, again, called the South Carolina Republican Creed. And it really spoke to me, even though I'm not a South Carolina native like Jim, my podcast co-host, is. I work with a lot of people from South Carolina, and I think a lot of these ideals, go well beyond not just South Carolina, but the Republican Party that these ideals were made to represent. But as it goes, although I think you should be able to follow along screen and read to yourself, the South Carolina Republican Creed starts with, "I do not choose to be a common man. It is my right to be uncommon. If I can seek opportunity, not security, I want to take the calculated risk to dream and build, to fail and to succeed. I refuse to barter incentive for dole. I prefer the challenges of life to guaranteed security, the thrill of fulfillment to the stale of calm of utopia. I will not trade freedom for benefits or my dignity for a handout. I will never cower before any master save my God. It is my heritage to stand erect, proud and unafraid, to think and act for myself, enjoy the benefit of creations, to face the whole world boldly and say, I'm a free American." So, not that I agree with every word that's listed in that creed. I'm going to switch back. What I think really stands out is just the self-accountability that it really means to be an American, that I think is so lost this day and age, especially with all of the government programs that we have, all the government agencies that we have, not just putting in place a false sense of security where, hey, you don't have to worry about all these problems or about safety because we have that under control, when in reality, if you're not responsible for your own safety, your own security, it's in the hands of someone else, and chances are they're not going to care about your safety and security as much as you as an individual are. So there's that aspect, but then there's also the tie-in with God. I don't believe in. I think, again, there should be a separation there. But maybe just as, if not more importantly, it's, again, this reliance on yourself and being a free American. And I think we've lost out on those ideals where, we've outsourced just about every sort of product that we rely on a daily basis, whether it's these clothes that I'm wearing. Chances are you're wearing other clothes that aren't made in America here as well. Of course, just about all of this technology, all these electronics products are made in China, and if not all of the components as well, at least the final assembly before it makes its way to the hands of the mass market consumer. And I think it's gone beyond just the products, right? Of course, by and large here, we're a service-based economy in the U.S., which I think obviously we want to be able to provide services to our fellow Americans, but not at the expense of being able to rely on the products, the devices, the vehicles, the clothes that we also rely on, right? So not that we should develop all of those products here in-house, but having the ability to at least produce some of them. So should there be worse trade sanctions with China, or heaven forbid, they decide that they want to go into Taiwan or otherwise, we have the ability to produce the platforms, produce the products that we need and not have to go months or years without them. And as much as it may seem like it's awful end of the world that we're having to pay so much more for our products, our services now in the short term, it really is, at least in my opinion, a Band-Aid that needed to be ripped off. That, say what you will about the man, Trump is, or was at the very least, the best person, or at least in the right position to bring about some of this change that was needed to be pro-America, America first. And again, beyond the products and services, at least he's a freely thinking, independent person, right? Whatever Trump is saying, by and large, is coming from Trump and not some suits behind the scenes that are saying, hey, here are the policies that we need to represent. And I think that goes far beyond just federal politics, right? We talked about, being a public teacher, and, we shouldn't rely on all of our teachers for the education of our youth either, right? That goes back to parents, at least until a child's 18. But even then, it seems like we've just outsourced our thinking as a country. And it's like, why do I need to, think? We have an expert to think on behalf of me. And that's by and large what's gotten us into this point where, yes, America is the best country to live in, whether you're wanting to start a business, build a family, whatever the case may be. I wholeheartedly believe that. That may not always be the case, especially with the direction that we've been heading over the last few decades. I think we're still by and large heading in that direction. Maybe it's been slowed down or plateaued a little bit with this most recent administration that we're under. But again, as we see, it just takes another couple years under an administration that's asleep at the wheel, or even worse yet, advocating more on behalf of the global citizenry than the American citizenry. And I don't think that's a future that we as Americans should want. Now, again, nothing against the people in China or any other, within any other borders outside of America. But even if we're looking at it from an immigration issue, people that want to come to America should want to also stay in America, build a business here in America, provide a valuable service, or help by joining a company producing products here. More importantly, or at least just as importantly, building a family here, and not just wanting America to be a great place for you and your life, but your kids' lives, your grandkids' lives, where also often you see people, support the illegal immigration or the asylum seeking that has made it not illegal immigration into this country, where they could have, great intentions, if you will, where they're not wanting to cause harm to anyone. They may even need some assistance, but at the end of the day, if they're not wanting to come in and be long-term Americans, more often than not, you see people that they come in, take advantage of the American economy, with a great job, or even a job that many Americans don't want to take. And then they move back to their home country with their family after they've made enough, and essentially just robbed from, other Americans, right? Rob that money from other Americans. And then if you also look at it from the standpoint where you get a lot of people, they'll come in, just maybe the head of a household, and then send their money back actively while they're living in America. And again, I get wanting to live a better life, but it needs to be for Americans first and foremost. And then if we can really live up to our ideals as a country, we can expand America in a non-colonialist sort of fashion. And while these may seem like pie in the sky sort of ideals, there's been members of Congress previously that have campaigned for similar sort of expansion of America, where it becomes the United States of Earth, or the United States of America really just becomes America is a global entity, right? And not to say there won't be any differences, across regions and how people want to be governed in each of these specific areas, but we already have a framework to support that in the U.S. You can go from, the far northeast corner of, Maine, and you're in a totally different world than the southwest corner of Las Vegas, not just by climate, but also by policies and just the demeanor of people. And given, yes, we all speak English, there are very real ways that you need to assimilate into this country. But you can still have plenty of differences and still be under a common law that respects the rights of you as an individual, not necessarily even as American. It just so happens that we're granted those rights because we had some great founding fathers, almost 250 years ago, a year shy from that. But not everyone else in the world, is lucky enough to be born into a land with these same sort of, God-given rights, if you will. And I would love to see that expanded to, the world around us. But it can't happen, at least in a way that's actually going to bring those rights in a way that will provide value if we don't take care of ourselves here first in America. And while I want to continue down on the path of the Star Spangled Banner, we'll come back to that. And I guess this does go kind of hand in hand with the whole idea of putting safety and security over freedom and bravery, right? The famous line in the Star Spangled Banner. I have a segment from a All In podcast episode that was recently posted, and Chamath Palihapitiya, a former executive of Facebook, doing great work now, and I actually want to give him credit, where he realizes the infrastructure that needs to be built in America to reindustrialize so we can compete at a global scale with the likes of China that subsidize and incentivize their companies and their people to build electronics products in a way that we just don't have the capability to anymore. But at the same time, he did voice a sentiment like, who's anti-safety and security? And it's not necessarily being anti-safety and security. It's just we can't put those on a pedestal. We can't make those the priorities of our people, of our country above all else, because otherwise that's how we're going to continue falling in the world rankings, right? Let China become the number one world power, arguably, if they're not already. And that's quite frankly not a world I want to live in. And hopefully many other Americans don't want to live in as well. But let me cue up this bit.
The courts, and there has been some resistance to sending in the National Guard, which is something, there's been a bit of saber rattling, Chamath, about maybe going into Chicago next. What are your thoughts on the National Guard issue?
They should. Look, here's the thing. Who is against safety and security? Who?
Right here,
and
this
why?
guy. No.
I don't understand.
So a little bit of context around this, and we can stop sharing that video. But the National Guard was deployed into Chicago, right? And there's been mayors all over the U.S., some and governors, some that are in support of it, some that are not. And while I don't want necessarily the Marines or the military being used, with against citizens or, on our own soil, what else is the National Guard there to protect us against illegal invasions of people, or even just say they're not criminals in the sense that they're going and vandalizing the streets or committing any violent crimes. Of course, that is happening as well, but just we do not have the resources to take care of this influx of 10, 20, as estimates as high as 50 million people that have recently come into this country. I would argue illegally, but then again, if you look at the prior administration that changed the asylum laws, so now they can be adjudicated or wait for their day in court, these asylum seekers in the United States instead of in Mexico where it was previously done. So we've just welcomed in tens of millions of people that we can't even afford to take care of ourselves in this country. As much as we like to talk about how wealthy and prosperous America is, and by and large it is, but if you actually look at, our deficit, our debt, not just as a country, but as individuals in a lot of cases, it is very clear that we are overextended and we need some change, right? We need to cut back some of these social care programs that oftentimes provide the safety and security that, again, I get that we want. We don't want anyone to go starve. We don't want anyone brutally murdered on the streets, but a lot of that can come just as much or even more so with freedom and bravery, putting ourselves out there as opposed to just letting the government come in and try to provide us all that we need to live a prosperous life. I've never seen that, whether it's in the United States or otherwise, actually a good way to, build what we call the American dream, or, getting into a nice single family home, finding a spouse that you want to spend the rest of your life with and raise kids with. And, just whether it's building a business or, just finding purposeful work. There's never been a case in history, not that I'm familiar with anyway, where government handouts have been able to provide that, right? And so I get what Chamath was getting at, but again, safety and security can't come at the expense of freedom and bravery. And, kind of jumping around a little bit, even though I butcher this quote oftentimes, referencing Benjamin Franklin, those that are willing to give up their freedom in turn of safety and security deserve neither their freedom nor safety. And I added on the security bit, but the actual quote from Ben Franklin is, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. And I could not, I am hard pressed to find a way to disagree with that. Of course, it's easy to say in practice, but going back to whether or not you're willing to put yourself on the line in a military uniform, as a public school teacher, as a local elected official, we need more people that are willing to, purvey, to evangelize these sort of ideals of freedom and bravery, where you go just about anywhere now and you're always hearing, hey, be safe. Why not? Like as a closing, as like, hey, see you later. Yeah, be safe, safe travels. How about be free, be brave? How about we don't really worry about the safety as much? It's like, if you really worry about the safety, just live in a bubble wrap suit. Don't leave your room. Don't go explore the world and, take advantage of all the opportunity it has to provide. And, this goes back to 9/11 even, which of course is coming up in a couple of days by the time we're recording this, and may even be posted on 9/11. That was, at least in my lifetime, one of the big changes that we saw, and it corresponded with the Patriot Act that came along just after it. All of us, or at least who could vote at the time, not myself, were big believers in these personal freedoms that we had, and just willing to give them up, all because of an incident of 9/11, which, tinfoil hat conspiracy time. You could even say the federal government, to some degree, even allowed 9/11 to happen, or, potentially even aided in pulling it off to some degree. And while that, again, sounds like conspiracy tinfoil hat talk, look at Pearl Harbor in World War II. And while that's not, necessarily accepted history, it is fairly commonly accepted, at least in conversation, that we let Pearl Harbor get attacked as a casus belli, as a reason of declaration of war, against Japan and against the Axis powers, because most people in the United States were against the U.S.'s involvement in World War II. There was even people, holding up signs and protesting that, I'm not trying to say Hitler wasn't, a force that wasn't needing to be stopped in Nazi Germany, but there is a very good case to be said that wasn't America's business. And especially after World War I, we were basically covering the debts of the UK. The UK had defaulted on all their loans, couldn't pay us back. And the only reason that we did get into World War II, arguably speaking, is when Britain, they were able to take all the gold, all the valuable belongings of their citizenry, use that as collateral to get the United States to back them with money and weapons, and ultimately, pull us into the war alongside them. But here we are many, many decades later, 6, 7, 8 decades later, still paying, for the price of World War II. And you could say, it's still, had a great impact on our economy and all the technology that we've been able to benefit from, afterwards. But how much of that innovation could have happened if we just, had public works projects, a few decades before, like John F. Kennedy, inspired the American people to, put them on the moon, put us on the moon. And again, not going to go too much into what could be tinfoil hat conspiracy talk there, but I think there's something to be said of just getting leadership in this country that is inspiring people to want to build more for themselves, build more for our fellow Americans, build more for our government, for our country, and less so, what is our country, what is our government going to do for us, as has been the case, not just, post-World War II or even pre-World War II with FDR, but definitely since Kennedy's John F. Kennedy, since Richard Nixon. I don't think we've had a leader that has really been a portrayal of these ideals, at least as much as Donald Trump. And again, I don't think he's the greatest leader by any stretch of the imagination. But if me personally, I was just going to rank all of our presidential leaders, going back at least till Richard Nixon, I'd maybe give Richard Nixon an 8 out of 10 as far as like what it means to be a leader, to represent this country. Donald Trump, I would give anywhere between a 6.5, 7.5. And between Richard Nixon and Donald Trump, I would struggle to give anyone more than a 6, maybe even a 5 as far as being a leader. Now, we've had great actors that could act as a great leader in the form of Ronald Reagan, who is literally an actor, or less so of a formal actor in President Obama. I grew up revering President Obama, and obviously very presidential in the form of how he can articulate an idea, a statesman, if you will. But I like to say Obama was great at making bad ideas sound great. And obviously not to the whole country. There was more than a fair share of people that didn't like Obama even running back in 2008 and more so in 2012. But to me, he was like the ideal of what a president should be for this country, until I actually started to look deeper into his background and just not even his background as much as like just long form content that he was putting out there, whether it's ideals for what he had with Obamacare, which I do think, again, we live in a day and age that people, especially in America, American citizens, should not have to worry about a broken arm, getting cancer. They should have the ability to go get treated publicly and not go bankrupt doing so. At the same time, I think we should have private healthcare options, which, again, wasn't totally being done away with Obamacare. But more importantly, I think you could just see a lot of what he was speaking about. It was almost like the cliche of a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? You'll hear one thing in a very presidential sort of manner, but then not actually enact those policies or do a complete 180 on those policies. And that's where, again, looking the part is different than actually, filling the part. And where Trump may not look the part and may not even do the best job at filling the part, I still think, if you give him a 6.5, 7.5, that's just basically borderline passing, right? And I think that's a fair assessment. Now, if we were to look at our other real candidate that we had as an option in Kamala Harris, I would struggle to give her anything more than a 2 out of 10. Where I do think our best option, Robert Kennedy Jr., unfortunately didn't really have the wherewithal in the form of financing to really make a big push. And that's where I think we really need someone like a Ross Perot that can independently not just finance their campaign, but also is articulate enough with ideas to, right the wrongs of this country, so to speak, again, to get people more aspiring to live up to the American dream, but not based off of what the government provides, based off of what you can provide for our fellow people, for your family, for yourself. And we unfortunately just haven't had anyone that has had really. Now it would be many billions of dollars that you would need to finance your campaign, put yourself out there. And even if it's not, military service, putting your life on the line, as we've seen now with Donald Trump most recently, taking a bullet for speaking out for what he believes in, obviously, famously, JFK, few presidents between have caught bullets or have at least caught attempts, if not every president has caught an attempt. Ross Perot, very similar as far as what I've heard. Don't know exactly how true this is, but the first time when he was running against George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, he was polling the night of the election about 19-20%. And that could have been far greater, as we saw the night of the election back in 2016. No one thought that night that Donald Trump was going to win. And so imagine if Ross Perot was already polling at 19-20% the night of the election, and then supposedly he gets a call basically with threats to his daughter that he needs to pull out of the race, momentarily pulled out, and then I guess made sure she was okay to some degree, and then put himself back in the ring. But I think at that time, as I understand it, those votes could no longer count since he had withdrawn from the race. So obviously, there are dangers with the public office, at least at this high of a level. But I think that's really what we're going to need to continue seeing, building on what Trump has done over these last couple years. And I would say even the rating that I gave Trump is for this new term, and obviously there's still more time than not left to go in the term. But one thing that I would give Trump credit about that a lot of people don't like to give him credit for is being able to admit that he's wrong. And people like Trump would never admit that he's done any wrong in his life. I've literally had conversations with people that say exactly that. And then you could go back to the second, or I guess third campaign for his now second presidency. He was going in long-form interviews, I heard him multiple occasions, talking about the mistakes that he made in his first term, not knowing what he was doing, not knowing the people to trust, and then entrusting power with some of those people that he thought had good intentions, but really working against him, working against the American people. And that's where, Trump says something like, hey, we have the enemy within. It's like, oh my God, Trump is trying to destroy America. But then you look at John F. Kennedy echoing the same sentiments, and he's looked at a hero. And that's where I just feel like Trump has been smeared probably more than any person in human history. I would say Nixon is up there, obviously to the point where he was smeared to stepping down after his impeachment. But it wasn't an impeachment that he was actually forced to step down. And I think Trump has been put in a similar position just because he's the messenger. He's taking the brunt, right? And obviously, he's the man behind the message as well in a lot of cases, but he has done a great job of bringing in people that, yes, you can say, especially his first term, he was operating more of a family office. You can say, hey, yeah, there's still a billionaire class around him that's making a lot of the decisions. Obviously, that's true to some degree, but that's true with any, politician, right? You got Kamala Harris that, got more backing from billionaires. I think by the number of billionaires, just not as many high net worth billionaires, which sounds kind of crazy because any billionaire is high net worth. But, there is quite a stark difference between a billionaire worth $1 or $5 billion versus those worth 100, 200, 300 billion dollars, right? So needless to say, obviously, Trump isn't necessarily a man of the everyday people, so to speak, but I do, and to me, it's not even close, think that he's more for the American people and the future of America, and not just in words and lip service. And actionable, like day in, day out work that he's doing, I think he's put in more hours of real valuable work than any president probably that we've ever had. Just the sheer amount of time that he's put in to this presidency, even in just the second term, I think would rival that of any president previously. And you even look back at like a founding father who wasn't, even around in the founding of this country, but is treated as such, having his face carved into stone on Mount Rushmore, Theodore Roosevelt. people think about how proactive he was, both in office and out of office. But then you actually go read about his time in office while he was serving as president, took a 6-month vacation, if you will, and just went out west. And so it's like, if you actually start to look at the politicians and these great figures of yesteryear, you'll see that they're not too different. And in some cases, probably would be looked at worse than some of the people that we look at as heinous criminals like Trump, you know? And not that I condone this action by any stretch of the imagination, but imagine any sort of political figure now, especially a guy that's hated as much as Trump, shooting their dog or shooting their neighbor's dog out of a fit of rage, or even like disregard shooting the dog, killing their neighbor's dog out of a fit of rage. And that was something that Theodore Roosevelt did one evening when he was a teenager, just having a tizzy, if you will. And it's like, imagine if that broke out now, where there's no way in hell Theodore Roosevelt would be elected president with how the news would treat that today. And yet he's now thought of as one of the greatest leaders of this country, right? And really as one of the greatest, people that's lived in a lot of people's eyes, right? And then you also look at, I already mentioned, him being out for 6 months, but Theodore Roosevelt had some unfortunate circumstances with his wife and then one of his daughters, I believe, and I could be getting this wrong, dying in the same day. And then his other daughter, while he was president, he had the famous quote of, "I can either take care of this country or I can take care of my daughter. I can't do both." Imagine if a politician were to come out and say that today. They would be, metaphorically speaking, hung on the streets. And that's where we, I think, get so lost on, like, hey, Trump's not seen as presidential, therefore he shouldn't be president, versus just actually looking at the actions of the individual more so than what they have to say. Of course, yes, what they have to say is important, especially in the terms of inspiring people, right? And not fear-mongering people. But at the same time, actions do speak louder than words. And I think that's where Trump has spoken much louder than any president, at least again since Nixon. All of that is to go back and say that we've created this false sense of security from people and procedures that actually make us feel safe, but in actuality are actually making us less safe. And while I can imagine it's been the case for as long as people have challenged government agencies and officials, it seems like more Americans would rather stay silent and not disrupt the status quo, not be ostracized, than actually speak about how they feel, what they think. And again, going back to that idea, we're not just outsourcing all the production of our goods, all of our consumer products, but outsourcing our thinking. And I'm hopefully challenging people, or at least inspiring people to, what can I produce here in the United States? Whether it's a product, whether it's a service, or again, it's just a thought that you're willing to go champion and put yourself out there, put the thought out there. Because otherwise our country is going to fall to the wayside. And I really don't want to see that happen. I want to see America always stay as a world power, at least as long as I'm alive. Luckily, if I'm lucky enough, have kids and they have kids, my grandchildren, they never have to worry about America not being the number one power of the world. And it's not so much that they won't have to worry. It's like they should want to worry, right? And be able to do the work, want to do the work. And I just find that we're more and more so, not just in America, but as a global society, figuring out how we can not do the work, right? And it's like every great civilization has been built on the back of slavery, as controversial as that may be to say it. We're now in a point, China's not going to be our slaves. All these third world countries are no really longer third world now that we're a global economy, and we have maybe not just as many people living in third world conditions in the US, we still have our own fair share of people living in third world conditions. And we shouldn't want that to be the case. I mean, again, we shouldn't want that to be the case anywhere. Obviously, I don't think we're ever going to live in a utopia where everyone has all their problems taken care of and, no new problems crop up. But if we do focus on what we can do as individuals for ourselves, for those around us, for our country, I think we can bring about a lot of the change that we're going to need to see over the next decade or two if we're not, at worst, wanting to lose our place to China as the world global power. And then, at worst, actually see them invade Taiwan, see them potentially invade the U.S. homeland. And as far-fetched as that may seem now, it's not the first time in our history, right? As we were talking about earlier on with the War of 1812, Fort McHenry being bombarded by the British, right? They had technical supremacy in a way that now China, if not they already have, they're clearly building in a way that we just can't compete. And you say, well, we'll meet them with our arms, because we're the greatest armed civilization that the world has ever seen. Well, I do agree in theory, right? That's how we were able to win the Revolutionary War with the Minutemen. We didn't need to have this grand standing army, right? But when we now live in a world of drones where $1,000 drone, much like a develop air drone that we make here, those are the new weapons of self-defense, right? And they should, of course, be used in military operations within law enforcement to protect our ideals as a country at large, but not at the expense of allowing our own individual American citizens to be able to utilize this technology. So whether it's another government like China wanting to invade our homeland, what are our, even our best assault rifles, if you will, going to do against tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of drones, let alone tanks or fighter jets or any much larger heavy pieces of military equipment, right? But now, as we've seen in the Ukraine-Russia war, we see $1,000 drones, $500 drones, $2,000 drones, really equalizing the playing field in a way that we haven't seen since, the early days of really the 6-shooter revolver that Samuel Colt brought into the world, right? As the saying goes, it wasn't God that made people equal, it was the Colt revolver. And I think, while I want drones first and foremost to be used from a consumer and commercial perspective, it's just as, if not more important, at least to the safety, or the freedom of our populace, or the autonomy of our populace, that we're able to own and operate these drones ourselves. Because as much as it might be deemed as fear-mongering and, again, unrealistic that China or some other global power that, builds up is going to come attack us on the homeland, the whole ideal of the Second Amendment was not to protect us against another government. It was to protect us against our own. And along the same lines, what are your handguns? What are your M14, M4s, M16s, other, again, assault rifles as a blanket inappropriate term, going to do against all of, our M1 Abrams tanks, or, even though we don't have the ability to field thousands of drones like they do in China, we still have, the Predator drones that were used pretty damn effectively, if you can use it in that sense, in the Middle East. And of course, we have other larger more expensive drone platforms that they'll take you out from miles away before you can even pull out a weapon as a form of self-defense, right? And that's where I think, again, we just really need to focus on reindustrializing here in America, build up a tech independence that, not saying we need to produce all of our, again, not even all prosumer goods or all of our consumer goods, but at least the technological goods that we rely on by and large on a day in, day out basis. Like, there's no American company that makes a consumer or prosumer camera anymore. Gone are the days of Kodak where they were leading the charge, not just in the digital camera, but, of course, the point and shoot camera starting with the Brownie, way back when, thanks to George Eastman leading the charge there. And then you look at computers. Yeah, we have some of the great tech giants of the world, but where is the technology actually produced now? China, some in India, some in Vietnam or Malaysia. But that wasn't always the case, right? And given, yes, the technology by the amount of dollars that you had to spend was greater back when it first came out. Personal computers, as an example, first came out in the late 70s, early 80s, right? You would spend $2,000-$3,000 of that late 70s, early 80s currency, and even really all throughout the 80s and even into the 90s, have computers that would cost many thousands of dollars. And now you were to equate that to today, people would be spending like $10,000 or more on a personal computer. And I would say maybe not in every case, that would still be worth it to a lot of people. Now, given had we just continued to build up our infrastructure so we could produce these at larger volumes with more efficiency, that price would continue to come down. Maybe not to the price that, countries like China can offer them at today, but even they can't really offer them at these prices today without the incentives and the subsidies that their government places on producing these products, specifically the electronics industry. And so, I'm not advocating for us being totally isolationist, independent from the world around us, but we really need to think about what do we rely on a day in, day out basis, and at least have the capability to serve an overwhelming majority, or at least a majority of our population with those products and services without being reliant on, foreign powers, especially those that are seen adversarial to us, or again, don't see the Chinese people as adversarial, but there are very clear differences in the way the China Communist Party wants to build and run a government versus the United States, right? And we're just at odds there. So I guess kind of wrapping this up, I just want to read a little segment that, or a comment that I had read recently that I think really summarizes this nice, that as much as it's like easy to point the finger at China and like China's eating our lunch and it's all like just the decisions that China are making that are allowing them to leapfrog us as a country, it's really, again, point the finger at us, or you point a finger at China, and in this case there's three pointing back at me, right? And I think people have been putting on blinders to those three fingers, right? But so deindustrialization, tech dependence, and crumbling infrastructure did not come from China. They came from decades of U.S. policy that prioritized short-term profit over long-term resilience. We shifted production overseas, opened the door to cheap labor markets, and helped accelerate China's growth, not because they forced us to, because it served corporate interests. Sometimes the threat is the system we built and accepted for far too long, and not external scapegoats. And obviously there's more nuance to the issue there. And again, it's not anything against the individuals of China, right? I want everyone to prosper as much as humanly possible. But at the same time, it really has come at the expense of the American populace. As much as it may have seemed better over the last couple of decades that we're getting these products that we rely on cheaper, when it comes at the inflation of the US dollar to the degree that we've never really seen as a country, it's all really for naught, right? You could be making a six-figure salary now and you're lower middle class at best, maybe upper lower class. Not till you get to about $250,000 or more, you start to really get into the conversation of, middle class in this day and age. And it doesn't take rocket science to actually like look at it this way, where a lot of people, especially under like Biden's administration, or even people that talk about how great the economy and the stock market is doing under Trump now, it's like, me like big numbers, me like see numbers go up. And it's like, if you actually look at what those numbers, or at the rate those numbers are going up, it doesn't make up for the difference of buying power, right? So if you go back to 1975, $169 $1,000 back then equates to $1 million today. So what used to be considered hey, you are making it in the United States, you're making it in the world, you are a part of like the 1% or very close to the top 1% of the world. If you're making a 6-figure salary, right? Like that was a big part of the American dream. And now, especially if you have a family, 6 figures, like you may as well be making damn near $30,000, right? There's like such a little difference between what $30,000 or even $250,000 means this day and age, especially when you look at it, as I was talking about, the disparity between billionaires, a billion and 5 billion versus, 200 billion. The disparity in this country and around the globe has just gotten so far out of hand. And it's by and large because we've been outsourcing all of the production of our goods that we rely on. And so all of this is to really just say, hopefully, if you watch this, you got inspired to see where you can also bring about change. And given, we're not quite to the point where we want to be as a company and helping the United States compete in the drone market, that's something that I've committed myself to for the last 8 years, going to continue doing so for the next decade or more. And again, just challenge or hopefully inspire you to think about what you can do for the next decade or more to really make America a greater place for all of us for the decades to come. So thank you for watching. We'll have some great podcasts coming up with some guests here soon. So if you don't want to just listen to me drone on for minutes and minutes on end, you'll be saved here with our next few episodes. Thank you.